let me introduce you. Nir Eyal doesn't require an introduction, but I'll try my best a little bit. Now, it's every product manager's or designer's dream, and even a holy grail, if you will, to build a habit-forming products, right? And most of our product managers, and I've been a product manager for more than a decade and a half, and this has been the pursuit, right? The pursuit is to build such products that users or people use, love it, and come back to it, right? Now, we have right now amongst us the prophet of habit-forming products, as MIT Technology Review called him. And he is one of the most original and innovative thinkers of our time. And truly, I mean, if you look at his works, either his books or the articles or the talks that is given, it's incredible. And I think he's doing an amazing service to the product community as well as the people who are consuming these products. So Nir is also the, I'm sure many of you know, is world best-selling author of 2 books. One, of course, which got everybody excited a few years ago on Hooked and how to build habit-forming products. At least I was pretty excited after reading that book about 2013. Is that the right time, Nir?
2014, right?
2014, right. Yeah, right. And then, of course, more recently, the Indistractable, right? How to control your attention and choose your life, right? So I think, I'll get to a minute about the Indistractable, but before that, I think by understanding how the habit-forming products hook us and what makes them so habit-forming, we can do something about it, right? And that seems to be the premise or the overall theme. And I'm using the word seems to be because, Nir, I'll get to that in a minute. But let me complete the introduction here. So for this book, Nir was awarded the Outstanding Work of Literature Award. It's not every day or everyone who gets this incredible work. Best Business and Leadership Books by Amazon, and several other awards. If I start reeling out, we will run out of time, right? So Nir also consults and teaches pretty interestingly about intersection of psychology, technology, and business, right? And of course, he's also a practitioner. He co-founded 2 tech companies, sold them, and a very, very active investor in habit-forming technologies, right? Most of the companies, many of you have heard, even Bright, I'm sure many of you have heard, Anchor, which got acquired by Spotify, Refresh, which again got acquired by LinkedIn, Product Hunt. Anybody who's in the product space knows about Product Hunt. So thank you for being here, Nir. It's a pleasure and a privilege to welcome you. But before we get started, 2 very simple opening questions, right? If you can get that, and then please go ahead with your presentation. Sure. So while we discuss this, I would like us to understand today. I see a lot of people joining this. It'll be good for you and for us to understand what is the composition of the people that are joining, right? What are the backgrounds? And so if we can launch the poll that basically gets us that information. While that is happening, a quick question to you, Nir. What product are you hooked on right now? Or are you completely immune to that at this stage?
Yeah, so getting hooked can be a very good thing. It's very different from an addiction. So the book is called Hooked: How to Build Habit-Forming Products. It's not called How to Build Addictive Products. There's a big difference. A habit is a behavior done with little or no conscious thought, and it's something that can be very, very healthy for us, right? Getting hooked to exercise, hooked to learning, hooked to all sorts of things that we can form good habits around. And that's really why I do what I do. It's not to get people addicted. And addiction is a persistent compulsive dependency on a behavior or substance that harms the user. So I would never preach for people to addict anyone. That's not a good thing to do. We would never want to do that. That's unethical, in fact. What we want to do is to get people hooked through healthy habits to the products we use. And frankly, the fact of the matter is, if you've tuned into the Product Leadership Festival, your problem is not addicting anyone. Let's face it. Very few people listening to me right now have a SaaS product that is addicting, and nobody's getting addicted to SaaS products. Nobody's getting addicted to educational products. Nobody's getting addicted to any of those things. The problem out there is not that a few companies have built the kind of products that get people addicted and suck them in. The real problem is that the vast majority of people making products out there are making products that suck, that people use because they feel like they have to, not because they want to. And so that's what we're going to talk about in this presentation, is how do we make these kind of products people want to use.
Super. I think somehow magically there seems to be some correlation here between what you're talking and the poll that came up. The poll that was to come up was to understand the audience, but it looks like that Nir is talking about hooked, and let's get a perspective on what people think the word hook means to them. And you know, I don't know if what you're saying got influenced, you know, people got influenced by that, but you know, the reason why I'm bringing that up is culturally as well. The word hooked has slight negative connotations, right? And in some cultures, at least, you know, at least casually in casual language that's used. But happy to see that many people here that's joining this conference believe it's positive, and which I believe was your singular intent of writing that book, of creating, you know, changing people's behavior for the better. Right?
Exactly.
Okay, awesome. The second one that I had was quickly. Now, I apologize for this. I actually sat down 2 weeks ago to read Indistractable, right? And I got distracted and by many things, right? So it looks like this particular book was written just for people like me, right? Now, is that true?
Absolutely. It's for anyone who finds that there are all sorts of distractions out there, whether it's, of course, we sometimes tend to blame the latest technology, but things have been distracting us for a very, very long time. And people have complained about every new technology. People used to say what they say today about cell phones and Facebook, they used to say about the television and the radio and even the written word. Socrates, the great Greek philosopher, complained about how distracting the world was 2,500 years ago. So this is not a new problem. What I hope to do is to help people become indistractable by learning the Achilles heel of how distraction works and how we can put it in its place. So hopefully you can finish the book and you can learn yourself how to become indistractable.
No, I quickly realized that it was for people like me, and thanks for elaborating on that. So with that, please take it away, all yours, and would love to hear. And by the way, as you speak, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions, and we'll be monitoring that.
Sure.
Right?
So if you monitor them, that would be fantastic. And then at the end, if you can just you know, pick out your favorites, and then I'll ask you to ask those.
Absolutely.
Perfect. All right. So let me just share my screen here.
Yeah.
And can you just confirm for me that you see Hooked on the screen?
Yes.
Okay, beautiful. All right. Well, welcome everyone. It is so good to have you here. It's a pleasure to have you join me today. You know, we have all seen what a profound impact these technologies that we're all carrying around with us in our pockets have on our day-to-day life. And so what we want to try and understand today is, what can we learn from the patterns used to design some of the world's most habit-forming products? When you think of a habit-forming technology, what do you think about? You probably think of Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or Snapchat or TikTok. You think about these world-changing companies that somehow have changed the habits of millions of people, if not billions of users' lives, and of course, in the process are making millions, if not billions of dollars. So how do we do that? How do we learn from these companies and take the lesson, the psychology behind how these companies get people hooked so that we can use these techniques ourselves? You know, when I wrote this book in 2014, this came out of a class that I taught for many years at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, and then later I taught at the Stanford the D School, the Hazel-Plattner Institute of Design. And when I taught this class, the goal of this class and this book is not to help the social media companies. It's not to help the video game companies. They already know everything in this book. My goal with this book was to help the rest of us, to help you build the kind of products and services that can build healthy habits in people's lives. And since the book was published back in 2014, it's sold 250,000 copies, and it's been used in every conceivable industry to do exactly that, to help people form healthy habits. I'll give you a few examples real quick. Companies like Kahoot, the world's largest educational software, uses the hook model to get kids hooked to learning. Fitbod uses the hook model to get people hooked to exercise. Companies like New York Times use the hook model to get people hooked to engaging with their local news. So the goal of this presentation is to help all of you build the kind of products and services that people use because they want to, not because they have to. Imagine what your business could look like. If you didn't have to spend all that money on expensive advertising and spammy messages, if people use the product that you're building that I and you both know could improve people's lives if they only use the product. How do we help build healthy habits in users' lives? That's what today is all about. And then we're going to take some questions quickly after the presentation. So make sure you have some questions throughout the presentation, then we're going to pick out some of those to answer in a bit. So to kick this off, let's make sure that we're on the same page about what we mean when we use this word habit. What is a habit exactly? A habit is not an addiction, as we talked about earlier. That is not the same thing. People get them confused. They are completely different things. A habit is simply an impulse to do a behavior with little or no conscious thought. It turns out about half of what you do every single day, day in and day out, is done because of a habit. And this is a very, very good thing because, of course, habits can be used for good. We can help people live happier, healthier, more productive, more connected lives by helping them use our products as a habit. So how do we do it? What's the secret? What's the psychology behind how these companies like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and WhatsApp and Amazon and YouTube and Google, how do they get people hooked? Well, it turns out they use this model called the hooked model. The hooked model is defined as an experience designed to connect the user's problem to your product with enough frequency to form a habit. Let me say that again. Write this down if you can. A hook is an experience designed to connect the user's problem with your product with enough frequency to form a habit. And it's through successive cycles, through these hooks, through these 4 basic steps that I'm going to explain here in the next few minutes. This is how customers' tastes are shaped, how our habits are formed, and how we keep customers coming back on their own without expensive advertising and spammy marketing messages. This is how we build the kind of products and services people use out of habit. So what we're going to do is we're going to walk through these 4 basic steps so that you can understand what it takes to build a habit-forming product for yourself to build healthy habits in users' lives. So step number 1 is the trigger phase. The trigger is a call to action. It tells us what to do next. Now, there are 2 types of triggers. The first type of trigger is what we call an external trigger. An external trigger is where there is some piece of information that tells the user what to do next. Something in our environment that gives us information for what to do. It can be a ping, a ding, a ring, anything in our outside environment that gives us information for what to do next, okay? Now, we in the product design community, we know all about these external triggers. This is what we do for a living, right? We design these external triggers to get people's attention. But what we don't understand, most of us, is that it's much more important not only to establish good external triggers, but in fact, it's more important if we are to form a habit to make sure that we can identify and build for what's called the internal trigger. An internal trigger is where the information for what to do next is not outside the user, but rather what to do next is stored as a piece of information and an association, a memory inside the user's own head. Now, what does this look like? Well, it can be being around certain people, partaking in certain routines, being in certain places, situations, and most frequently, when we experience certain emotions. Emotions are the most frequent internal triggers. Now, it's not only just any emotion that triggers these habits, but in fact, it's a certain type of emotion. It is in fact negative emotions. What we do when we're feeling bored or lonesome or indecisive or fatigued or discouraged or bored, what we do when we experience these negative emotions prompts us to action, makes us look for relief with some kind of product or service. Now, the way we know this is true is that we know, there's been several studies on this, but one of the most startling studies found that people with clinical depression check email more. Do you hear that right? People with clinical depression check email more. Why would that be? Why would people suffering from clinical depression check email more? It turns out that people suffering from clinical depression experience what we call negative valence states. They feel down more frequently than the rest of the population. And what are they doing to boost their mood to get out of that negative valence state? they're going online, they're checking their devices, they're looking at email more often than the rest of the population. Now, of course, you don't have to be clinically depressed for this to affect you. All of us do this to some degree. All of us partake in this. All of us use habit-forming products for one reason or another because of these negative emotions. Let me test you. Where do people go? Where do you go when you're feeling lonely? What app or website do you check? Well, maybe it's WhatsApp, maybe it's Facebook, right? A lot of people use this product when they're feeling lonely, when they're seeking connection. Here's another one. Where do we go when we're feeling unsure about something? Before you scan your brain to see if you know the answer to the question, you are Googling it, of course. And what about when you're feeling bored? You know, between 2 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon, there's that big project you don't want to work on right now. Where do you go to take your mind off of things? You check YouTube, you check the news, you look at sports scores, stock prices, Reddit, Pinterest. Lots and lots and lots of products and services cater to this uncomfortable emotional trigger of boredom. Now, what do we do with this? What's the lesson here that I'm trying to impart is that if you want to build a habit-forming product, you have got to be able to tell me, what is your customer's internal trigger? This is incredibly important. If you don't know your customer's internal trigger, you're just hoping to get lucky. And I'm not just talking about a functional level. I can't tell you how many of my clients I sit down with and I ask them, what's the internal trigger, right? What's the emotional itch that gets your customer to use this product out of habit, out of little or no conscious thought? Oh, they say, oh, we build this kind of product that, is an enterprise service software that does this. No, that's not the question. The question is, what is the psychological itch? Boredom, loneliness, fatigue, uncertainty. What is the feeling that your customer is trying to escape with sufficient frequency to form a habit around? You have got to be able to answer this question. It is absolutely critical. Let me give you an example, I think, of a company that did this particularly well, Instagram. Think about the first time you used Instagram. What were the external triggers? It's probably that you saw somebody post about it on Facebook or Twitter. Somebody posted a picture that said, hey, check out my photo on Instagram. They get you to install the app. Now you have an external trigger on your phone, right? That external trigger has a little notification that tells you every time somebody does something on the app, like they posted a picture or they mentioned you. That would be the external trigger. But what about the internal triggers? What are the internal triggers to using a product like Instagram? The internal trigger is that it solves the pain of losing the moment, right? That when you want to capture something and you want to keep it forever and you're afraid it's going to be gone, right? The internal trigger is the fear that that moment might be gone forever, right? When you take a picture of a beautiful sunset or a delicious food, a delicious plate of food, or your cute dog, it's not that your dog said, take a picture of me with Instagram. There's no external trigger that tells you what to do. And yet there's this spontaneous fear that if I don't capture this moment, it's gone forever. Incredibly powerful internal trigger. Now, what's so brilliant about Instagram is that it's much more than just the internal trigger of the fear of losing the moment. The more we pass through Instagram's hook, the more we begin to associate it with other internal triggers. When we're feeling bored, stressed, FOMO. What's FOMO? Fear of missing out. It's actually a real word in the Merriam-Webster dictionary. The fear of missing out is not only why we take pictures with Instagram, it's also why we keep going back to Instagram, because Instagram is not just a camera, it's a social network. It's a way to catch up with what's going on with our friends. And so that becomes an internal trigger through successive cycles that keeps us coming back again and again and again. Very powerful internal triggers that they use. So that's just the tip of the iceberg. I hope you'll check out my book. I hope you'll forgive me. I'm trying to cram 10 years of research into about 30, 40 minutes here. But the point I want to leave you around these triggers is that you have got to understand on a psychological level, not just a functional level, what itch your product is scratching. What is the pain point, the psychological pain point that your product is trying to alleviate? Because if you cannot articulate it to me, you have very low chance of actually building a habit-forming product in this day and age. You're just hoping to get lucky. You've got to be able to articulate what is your customer's internal trigger. The next step is the action phase. The action phase is defined as the simplest behavior done in anticipation of a reward. The simplest thing the user can do to get relief from that psychological itch, right? So whether it's boredom or loneliness or fatigue or uncertainty, whatever it might be, what's the easiest thing that I can do to get relief from that discomfort? Now, I'm going to show you a few habit-forming products, and I want you to see how simple the action phase is in every one of these products. For example, scrolling on Pinterest, for example, how easy is that? Just that act of scrolling, or a quick search on Google, or what could be easier than just pushing the play button on YouTube? Very simple actions done in anticipation of a reward. Now, there's actually a formula that helps us predict the likelihood of any solitary behavior. And this comes to us from a researcher at Stanford by the name of B.J. Fogg. And Dr. Fogg tells us that for any human behavior, offline, online, enterprise software, consumer web, mobile, doesn't matter. Any behavior requires three things. Every human behavior requires sufficient motivation, that's the M, sufficient ability, ability is how easy or difficult something is to do, and the T stands for trigger. We just talked all about triggers. So let's dive in for a little bit more detail around motivation and ability. Motivation, according to Edward Deci, the father of self-determination theory, he tells us that motivation is the energy for action, how much we want to do a particular behavior. And we know that all human beings on the face of the earth respond to these 6 factors of motivation. All of us seek pleasure, we avoid pain. We seek hope, we avoid fear. We seek social acceptance, and we avoid social rejection. So where we see this manifest is with advertising, right? The advertising industry, every billboard you see, every television commercial, every radio ad fundamentally uses one or more of these 6 levers of motivation to boost the energy for action. But of the 3 elements of behavior, motivation, ability, and a trigger, the most important after the trigger is not motivation, okay? It's much more important from a product design perspective to talk about ability, okay? Most people get this wrong, by the way. Most people in the product design community, they say, well, if people just knew how great our product was, if we just convinced them and showed them videos and testimonials, well, then they'll be more motivated to use our product. That is almost never the answer. The answer from a product design point of view is not to increase motivation, but instead to increase ability. What is ability? Ability is the capacity to do a particular action. It is how easy or difficult something is to do, because one truth that we have seen time and time again in the consumer psychology sphere is that the easier something is to do, the more likely people are to do it. That's common sense. The easier something is to do, the more likely people are to do it. So if you want your customer to do something, you have to make it easier to do. Well, what does that look like? Well, here again, we have these 6 levers of motivation, these 6 things that we can pull on to make a user more likely to take a particular action by increasing their ability. These factors of ability are time, how long something takes, how much money something costs, how much physical effort is required to do a particular behavior. Brain cycles. This is a big one, particularly when it comes to the product design community, because the harder something is to understand, this is called cognitive load. The more cognitive load, the more brain cycles, the more the customer has to think about what you're trying to get them to do, the more difficult it is for them to do the behavior and the less likely they are to do it. Social deviance says that we become more likely to do something when we see other people like us doing it. And finally, non-routine says that we become more likely to do something when we have done it before in the past. What is that called? That's called practice, right? The more we do something, the easier it gets, the more likely we are to do it in the future. So we can actually take these 3 basic features of motivation, ability, triggers, and we can put them on a conceptual graph. And if you haven't seen this before, please share this with your team, screenshot it. It's incredibly empowering. Because what Fogg's work tells us is that for any human behavior, if the customer, the user, is not doing what you've designed for them to do, let's say you've built a beautiful new app or an amazing new website, and darn it, people aren't doing what you've designed for them to do. Well, there are only 3 reasons why. Either they lack motivation, ability, or a trigger. Like we can see it right here in this graph. That only when the user has sufficient motivation, right? On the y-axis, high motivation, low motivation, and the user has sufficient ability. So if something is easy to do, it's on the far right. If something is hard to do, low ability, it's on the far left. And it's only when the user has sufficient ability and motivation that they cross that red threshold. And if and only if the trigger is present, if it's above that red threshold, if the trigger is present, the behavior will occur every time. Online, offline, enterprise, consumer, doesn't matter. Your behavior, your kid's behavior, your spouse's behavior, your customer's behavior, every click, every purchase always has to have sufficient amounts of motivation, ability, and a trigger. That is the only 3 reasons why customers don't do what you've designed for them to do. So now you know how to fix the problem. If a customer isn't doing what you've designed for them to do, if they're not taking the action, you know why. It's all about figuring out how to fix that problem once we have diagnosed where the illness is, so to speak. So let's make this very practical. I want to give you a very good example. I'm not sure if this company is in everyone's country who's tuning in, but this is a very large, I think the largest rental car company in the United States of America. It's called Enterprise Rent-A-Car. Now, Enterprise Rent-A-Car, their website, their homepage used to look like this. If you went to enterprise.com, it used to look like this. Now, ask yourself for a moment, what is the intended action? If you are Enterprise Rent-A-Car and you want people to rent cars from you, what is the intended behavior? What is the intended action you would want them to take on this page? Of course, it's to look up the availability of a car, right? Start renting the car. That is the behavior that the company and the customer wants to do. Look at all the stuff on this page that is not that, right? This is what we call distraction. It's all the things that are not what I want to do, right? And so what this did was increase cognitive load. The customer has to think, I just want to rent a car. How do I do that? And so what they saw was that all this distraction limits the action that both the company and the customer wants to take. So here's what they did. Here's what Enterprise Rent-A-Car's website looks like today. Look at this. You see the difference? This versus this. Why did they do that? They removed the cognitive clutter. They made it so much easier for people to do the thing that they want to do with your website. And I can't tell you how common of a problem this is, that people don't understand still in this day and age, that when you design a product, whether it's offline, online, enterprise, consumer, does not matter. Make the intended behavior as easy as possible to do. Increase ability to get more of the intended behavior. I know some of you are tuning in, you don't work in the internet space at all. Maybe some of you work with products and services that are physical goods. Well, this rule applies as well. No matter if it's online, offline, enterprise, consumer, doesn't matter. We always have to ask ourselves, what is in the user's way? Here's a great example of a physical product. Now, this company is called Show Pharmaceuticals, and they make vitamins. And they found that one of the biggest problems that they had with their customer base was that people didn't buy vitamins as frequently as they expected. And so they thought people were buying somebody else's vitamins, but that wasn't the case at all. When they interviewed their customers, they found that actually people loved Show vitamins, they just weren't taking them. And then they dug a little deeper and they found why. You paid money for these vitamins, why aren't you taking them? And it turns out that people would just forget. They wouldn't get into the habit of taking their vitamins. So they dug even deeper. They did some more ethnographic research and they observed customers and learned the number one reason people weren't taking their vitamins was that they weren't visible. They would hide the vitamins in some drawer somewhere or some shelf and they couldn't see them. The second reason that people didn't take their vitamins is that they couldn't remember whether they had taken them already. And so they didn't want to take too many. And so here's what they did. They put their vitamins, as opposed to all their competitors that make these ugly bottles that nobody wants to look at every day and they forget to take, they made these bottles that are meant to be displayed. They are meant to be put by your toothbrush. Why? Because you brush your teeth every morning. And so they put these products so that you put them upside down on this little stand right next to your toothbrush. Here's what else they did. In order to help people reduce the cognitive load and therefore increase their ability to take the intended behavior of taking their vitamins every morning, they built a dispenser that tells you whether you have taken the vitamin that day into the bottle. So when you take a vitamin, you snap it together, you squeeze it, a vitamin comes out, and it rotates to tell you, oh, you took your vitamins for Sunday, today is Monday, you won't need to take it again until Monday. Genius. They also, by the way, if you look at the pills, they're also very easy to swallow. They're much smaller. They figured that people actually can take more of these vitamins, or sorry, the same amount of vitamins if they took more pills in smaller, with smaller pills. So they thought of everything they could possibly do to increase ability, and therefore they were much more likely to get people to take the intended behavior, send them through the 4 steps of their hook, and form a consumer habit. Now, the third step of the hook. You guys ready for this? This is my favorite part of the hook model. The third part of the hook model, after we have figured out the internal trigger, after we have made the intended behavior as easy as possible to do, the next step of the hook model is the reward phase. The reward phase is where the user gets what they came for. It's where their itch is scratched. Now, if we are going to talk about rewards, we have to talk about the brain. And in particular, in every area of the brain that we call the nucleus accumbens. The nucleus accumbens was first studied by 2 Canadian researchers back in the 1940s by the name of Olds and Milner. Now, Olds and Milner discovered that this area of the brain had some very peculiar properties. They noticed that when they implanted electrodes into the brains of lab animals and then gave these lab animals a little lever that they could push on that sent an electrical jolt to this part of the brain, the lab animals in this study wanted to do nothing but activate this part of the brain. They could self-stimulate again and again. They would forgo food, water, they would run across painful electrified grids just to activate this part of the brain. Now, in later experiments done on people, what researchers observed that when people were given a little button to press on, and every time they pressed on this button, they would receive an electrical jolt to their own nucleus accumbens, they observed the same exact results. Some of the people in these studies had to have the machines forcibly removed from them to get them to stop activating their nucleus accumbens. Now, the good news is we do not have to implant electrodes in people's brains to activate their nucleus accumbens. Your nucleus accumbens is activated every single day with things like this: luxury goods, junk food, sex, certain chemicals, and of course, right there in the center, our technology. All of these things activate the reward center of the brain every single day. Now, for many years, Olds and Milner believed that the purpose of the nucleus accumbens was to stimulate pleasure, right? Isn't that why the lab animals wanted to incessantly activate the nucleus accumbens? Isn't this why we keep searching for all these things that make us feel good, right? Doesn't that make sense? Well, not exactly. It's actually a bit more nuanced than that. And there's a lot of misunderstanding about this. A lot of people think that, oh, the dopamine and the oxytocin, that's like cocaine in the brain. Not at all. That's not at all how these neurotransmitters work. It turns out what we now know that Olds and Milner never did is that the way the brain gets us to act is not by making us feel good per se. It's about stimulating the stress of desire, the wanting, the craving reflex. And the way we know this is that we can actually see what is happening in people's brains when they are anticipating a reward. Because as you can see here from this fMRI study, that the brain the nucleus accumbens that you can see there in yellow and red becomes most active in anticipation of a reward. But when we finally get the thing that we want, when we get the thing that we think is going to make us happy and make us feel good, when we finally get what we think is going to make us happy, that's when the nucleus accumbens becomes less active. So the way the brain gets us to act is not by making us feel good per se, it's by creating this itch that we seek to scratch, this wanting, this craving reflex. And I can tell you a way that you can supercharge your customer and users' stress of desire. In fact, I can tell you how to manufacture desire. Does anybody out there want to know how to manufacture desire? Are you curious how you can make desire out of thin air?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I'm doing it
Absolutely.
for you right now. So when I took that long pause and I didn't say anything for a minute and I asked you a question, some of you perked up. Why did he stop talking? What's he going to say next? What's the answer to the question? And that's exactly the point. What I just did to you was use what's called a variable reward. You see, the unknown is fascinating, and uncertainty, mystery, causes us to engage, it causes us to focus, and it is highly habit forming. Now, this research is a classic study that came to us from the work of B.F. Skinner, the father of operant conditioning. He took these pigeons, he put them into a little box, and he gave them a little disc to peck at. And he taught the pigeons to peck at the disc whenever they were hungry. By the way, the hunger was the internal trigger, right? That was the itch. If the pigeons were well fed, they did not do anything, right? They were happily going about their business. But if the pigeon was hungry, if there was an internal trigger, he could train the pigeon to peck at the disc to get a reward. In this case, he gave them a little food pellet. He gave them a little reward. Now, everything went great. And this is what you could expect, when you train your puppy or train your kids. This is called operant conditioning. Do this, get that, right? We've all seen this before in real life. But then something very interesting happened. You see, one day, Skinner ran out of these food pellets. He didn't have enough of these rewards for his pigeons. And so he had a problem. He couldn't afford to give it to the pigeons every day. He could only afford to give it to the pigeon once in a while. So sometimes the pigeon would peck at the disc, no food pellet, nothing would come out. The next time the pigeon would peck at the disc, they would receive a reward. And what Skinner observed, to his amazement, was that the rate of response, the number of times the pigeon pecked at the disc, increased when the reward was given on a variable schedule of reinforcement. Why does this happen? Because variability activates the nucleus accumbens, creating this desirous response, activating the wanting reflex. And so in all sorts of products that we find most engaging, most habit forming, the things that capture your attention and won't let go, you will always find one or more of these three types of variable rewards. Rewards of the tribe, rewards of the hunt, and rewards of the self. Let me introduce these to you briefly. Rewards of the tribe are all about the search for social reward. Things that feel good, that have this element of variability, but come from other people. The search for empathetic joy, feeling good because someone else feels good. Partnership, cooperation, competition, all of these things feel good, have this element of variability, and come from other people. Best example online is social media. Of course, when you go on to Facebook or Instagram or WhatsApp or TikTok, you're always uncertain about what you might see. What did people post? What do the comments say? How many likes does something get? High degree of variability involving our social networks. The next type of variable reward is what we call rewards of the hunt. Rewards of the hunt are all about the search for resources. And this, of course, comes from our primal search for material possessions. But in modern society, we buy these things with money. And so when many people think about variable rewards, the classic example is a slot machine, right? When you go gamble, what keeps us engaged with one of these games of chance is the uncertainty around what we might win, the money that you might get by playing blackjack or pulling on a slot machine. Interestingly enough, we see the exact same psychology at work online. If you think about for a minute the feed, what is it about the feed? Have you noticed how everything mobile has a feed these days? Why is that? Why does everything today have a feed? Take a look at LinkedIn, for example, right? LinkedIn was bought by Microsoft a few years ago. What is it about the LinkedIn feed that makes it so enchanting? Well, when you log into LinkedIn, maybe the first story is not that interesting. The second story is not that interesting. Maybe the third or fourth story is interesting. And what do you have to do to see more interesting content? You just have to scroll. And that scrolling and scrolling and scrolling uses the exact same behavior as pulling on a slot machine. It's all about the variable rewards of the hunt for information, searching and searching and never done searching for that next reward. The next type of variable reward is what we call rewards of the self. Rewards of the self are things that feel good, that have this element of variability, but don't come from other people and aren't about the search for any kind of material possessions. These are things that feel good in and of themselves. They are intrinsically pleasurable. The best example online is, of course, gameplay. When someone plays Animal Crossing or Angry Birds or whatever other game they might play online, they're not necessarily playing with other people. They're not even winning anything in terms of material possessions, but there's something fun and exciting about getting to the next level, the next accomplishment, the next achievement. And so even if you don't play one of these games, I know everybody here, we're all very serious business people, right? None of us play these online games, do we? Well, even if you don't, I bet you play this game every single day. Let me know if this looks familiar. How about your email? This is a game you play probably every single day if if you're like most people. Email is probably the mother of habit-forming technology because there's all these variable rewards where that need to check that unread message. What's in it? Is it good news? Is it bad news? Who's it from? Clearing your inbox, finishing the to-dos on your to-do list. All of these things are about the search for mastery, consistency, competency, and control. So the idea here behind the variable rewards phase is to give people what they want, to scratch their itch, and yet leave them wanting more. This is not about cheesy gamification. It's not about points and badges and leaderboard. That stuff almost never works. It's about scratching people's psychological itch. And back to the internal trigger phase, this is why it's so important to start by understanding what is your user's internal trigger. If the internal trigger is uncertainty, we have to give people assurance. If the internal trigger is loneliness, well, then we have to connect people together. The point of the variable reward phase, it's not some sort of gimmick. It's about giving people what they need. It's about giving them whatever it is they came to your product for in the first place, and yet leaving a bit of uncertainty around what they might find next time they engage with the product or service. Finally, the last step of the hook model is the investment phase. The investment phase is where the user puts something into the product to increase the likelihood of the next pass through the hook. And investments do this in two ways. The first way that investments increase the likelihood of the next pass through the hook is by loading the next trigger. Loading the next trigger. Loading the next trigger is when something you do in the investment phase gets you to load the next trigger so the customer comes back on their own, not some piece of spammy messaging or marketing that you send the user, but something that I did to bring myself back. Let me give you a great example. When you send someone a message on WhatsApp, you don't get any kind of immediate reward. What's the immediate gratification of sending someone a message? There's no points, there's no badges, nothing happens when you send someone a message, unless you get a reply. So every time you invest in the platform, you are loading the next trigger because every one of those replies comes coupled with, what is that an example of that you see on your screen right now? What is that notification, that meatball icon an example of? That is an example of an external trigger. This is where we began the whole presentation, an external trigger that prompts you through the hook once again. So the first way that investments increase the likelihood of the next pass to the hook is by loading the next trigger to bring the customer back based on their own volition, something that I did to bring me back again through the hook. The other way that investments increase the likelihood of the next pass through the hook is by storing value. Now, this is a really, really big deal. This is a revolution in the way that products are built, in that investments can store value in the product the more it is used. This is a really revolutionary idea, because if you think about it, everything in the physical world, all physical products, they depreciate with wear and tear, right? When you use, your furniture, your clothing, everything that you use in the physical world that's made out of atoms rather than bits, it depreciates, it loses value with wear and tear. But habit-forming products do the opposite. They appreciate, they get better and better the more they are used. What does this look like? Content, for example, is one form of stored value. The more content you upload to Google Drive or Dropbox, the better it becomes as your cloud storage solution, the more valuable it becomes to you. The more data you give a company, for example, Mint.com or personal finance software, Pinterest, Facebook, any of these companies, the more data you give them, you are building the product in real time just for you. So if you were to log into my Pinterest account, my Instagram account, my Facebook, it wouldn't be interesting to you because it's been customized based on my data that I gave the company that customizes the product just for me. Followers is another form of investment that increases with use. The more followers someone has, the better the product is as a way to reach their audience. So if, let's say you had two different kinds of people, someone with 10,000 followers and someone with 10 followers. Now, let's say that Twitter one day decides that they're going to start charging people to use Twitter. You have to pay to use Twitter. Who do you think is more likely to pay Twitter? Would it be someone with 10 followers or someone with 10,000 followers? Obviously, it would be the person with 10,000 followers because they've stored more value in the product in their form of their follower count. Finally, reputation. Reputation is a form of stored value that users can literally take to the bank because my reputation on products like Upwork and eBay and Airbnb dictates what I can charge for my various goods and services. And so that's a form of stored value that I get paid more for based on my reputation, even if a better product comes along. Imagine if there's another competitor to eBay or Upwork and Airbnb, but you're on these platforms and you already have a great reputation. How likely are you to stop using those products after you've built this amazing reputation? It's kind of hard to do, right? It's kind of sticky. It's kind of tough to leave once you've made this investment in the product in the form of your reputation score. So that's it. The 4 parts of the hook model: the trigger, the action, the reward, and the investment. These are the 4 steps that help people form habits with your product and service. This is how customer preferences are shaped. These are how our habits take hold. And it's through successive cycles, through these steps, and with these 5 basic questions. And I invite you to take a picture of this This is the most important slide of the presentation. The Hooked Canvas teaches us how to ask these 5 fundamental questions if we are building a habit-forming product. Number 1, what is the internal trigger that the product is addressing? Number 2, what's the external trigger that prompts us to action? Number 3, what is the simplest behavior done in anticipation of reward? Is the reward fulfilling and yet leaves the user wanting more? And then finally, what is the bit of work done to increase the likelihood of the next pass through the hook? Now, before I take some questions, there is one more topic I'd like to address, which is the morality of manipulation. You see, many people, when they understand how these products are designed to change user behavior, and then they start thinking about using it in their own business, they kind of take a pause and they say, well, is that ethical? Is it okay to use people's hidden psychology to get them to do what we want to do? And if you had that reaction, I say bravo. That is exactly the humane response to understanding the power that we have to change people's behavior. And so what I implore you to do is to understand that you have a very special responsibility, because product design is manipulation. What you do for a living, if you are a product designer, is you are manipulating people's behavior. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes we want to be manipulated. We want products to help us exercise, be more productive, connect with loved ones, save money. We want that to happen. But we have to understand that we have a very special and powerful responsibility to make sure that we use these techniques appropriately. Because many of these products that we use, this is what people take to bed with them every night. It's the first thing we reach for in the morning before we even say hello to our loved ones. And so we have to ask ourselves, what special responsibility do we have? And so what I implore you to do is to use these techniques to help people find something meaningful, something important, to use it in a way to help people solve these common human problems. And I believe that we have a very special opportunity to use behavioral design and habit formation for good, to help people build happier, healthier, more productive lives, and to borrow and take liberties from the words of Gandhi to help build the change that you want to see in the world. And with that, thank you so much for your attention. I appreciate it. I have a quick favor to ask before we go to questions, which is I would love to hear what you thought of the presentation. I know many people asked me for the slides that I just presented, and I'm happy to give those to you. If you would be so kind to go to this URL, opinion2.us. If you have an iPhone, you can just point at the screen at that QR code, and it'll take you to that URL. There's a very short survey there. It's only 5 questions. Would love to know what you thought of the presentation. I read every one of your comments. If you have any questions in particular you want to address, I'll look at every one of those. Would love to know what you thought of the presentation. If you would be so kind as to fill out that survey, when you click submit, you will get a link to my SlideShare page where you can have all the slides you just saw. You can share them with your colleagues, keep them, do whatever you like. We have a few minutes for questions. If I don't get to your question, please do visit me on my website, nirandfar.com. You can see it there at the bottom. Nir is spelled like my first name, nirandfar.com. You can fill out a contact form there. If I don't get to your question today, happy to answer those questions later on. And with that, let's dive into some questions.
Well, totally fascinating. Awesome. Thank you so much, Nir. And I think there are questions pouring in, but I've been trying to take notes and quickly summarize what you just said before we get to the questions, right? You started off with the habit and the hook model and what that definition is, moved on to the hooked canvas in the 4 stages of it, the triggers, the actions, and in the triggers, you talked about internal and external triggers. Now, external triggers are something that are obvious to many people, but internal are the ones that we need to figure out and the right moment and the right stage. Of course, a lot of negative emotions involved in there. And then, moving on to the reward stage, which has variable rewards. I think fascinating. You brought in various behavioral theories and cognitive models that many others have propounded and connected that with some really good examples for us to understand how products are using those to leverage and make them better, especially the show one, the enterprise one, and of course, the ubiquitous badges that we are all bombarded with. And then of course, spending time on investment aspect of it, loading the next trigger, and the most important one is stored value, right? So the product gets better as you use, either it's a network effect or it is the data that you're giving, which increases the value of that product. And I'm glad that you brought up this morality of manipulation, because often when people come to understand this power, it requires a lot of responsibility to use it properly for the good. And I'm glad that you brought up. So few questions. Let me just go over them. And for those of you who still have questions, please go ahead and ask them in the LinkedIn thread. And I'm sure when Nir gets time, we'll do that. So questions from, let's say, Mario Hanmant, particularly are asking, is there a same approach or a slightly different approach to identifying these internal triggers for enterprise applications? Now, most of the examples that we saw were for consumers and B2C individuals, but what about the enterprise apps?
Yeah. Sorry, let me just do this one thing. I realized I wanted to add the URLs for the survey. Here it is again, sorry. And my blog, I just added it to the chat as well. If you could add that to LinkedIn as well, that'd be great. Awesome. So in terms of enterprise versus consumer, now, the presentation, I didn't have time to cover both consumer and enterprise, but the fact of the matter is it's not important. There is no distinction between habits that are formed, the model for forming habits between enterprise and consumer web. It is exactly the same. It's the same 4 steps of trigger, action, reward, and investment. You have to follow the exact same 4 steps. The only difference is, of course, that the internal triggers will be different, right? A consumer web product that addresses loneliness and seeking connection is not the same type of internal trigger for an enterprise software that might cater to uncertainty or stress in the workplace. So the same basic 4 steps apply. In fact, if you go ahead and fill out that survey and go to my SlideShare page, there is a presentation there that's called Hooked in the Enterprise. If you scroll down on the right-hand side, you'll see a bunch of presentations. One of them is called Hooked in the Enterprise. It is the exact same model, the same 4 steps, but instead of presenting Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, it's presenting Salesforce and GitHub and Slack, right? It's all enterprise software. And in fact, I would argue that habits in enterprise software are more important than even consumer products, because if your product is the kind of product that's purchased monthly, right? If it's a SaaS product, if a customer looks at the bill every month, right? You can argue that with a consumer web product, many consumer web products you don't pay for. You're not paying for Instagram with cash. You're not paying for Facebook with cash. But an enterprise product, somebody's getting a bill every month. And if they look at that bill and say, what the heck is this software? Is anybody using this around here? And the answer is no, you're a goner. They're not going to pay because they don't use it. They're not getting value from it. So it's even more important, I think, in the enterprise space to make sure that your product does form a habit if it's used with sufficient frequency.
Great. So a follow-up question on that, I think Gautam and a couple of others are asking is, typically enterprise products focus on solving a particular problem, more functional needs, if you will, right? And so is it worth, or is it, the approach that you explained, is it even important to address the other triggers that you just explained on all of that?
Well, so not every product needs to be habit forming. I want to be very clear. This is not some magic pixie dust that every business, sprinkles on it and becomes the next Facebook or Salesforce. That it's only for a certain type of product. It's for a type of product that is used with sufficient frequency. That's, that was part of the definition of what is a hook. It's connecting your user's problem to your product with enough frequency to form a habit. That was the definition I shared earlier. So many products are not used frequently, right? If you're building some kind of, server-side software that's not used unless something breaks, that you don't have to form a habit. You sell it once and you forget it. That's it. The problem with those type of products is that you have to have some kind of other competitive advantage. A habit is one of many competitive advantages. There are many others: intellectual property, brand, economies of scale, network effects. There's many other competitive advantages. Habits are one of many. The problem is if you don't have one of those competitive advantages and you don't have a habit, you are constantly beating each other up on price and features. So for example, take insurance, okay? Car insurance, home insurance, that's not going to become a habit. Nobody uses car insurance habitually, right? You only use it, God forbid, if something terrible happens, that's when you use car insurance. So it's never going to become a habit. So the problem is that, one company says, oh, your rate is this. The other company says, oh yeah, our rate is that minus $2. And so you compete on price and features and price and features. And so you don't have any kind of excess return. Yeah. And so you have to have some kind of competitive advantage. And I think habit is one of the ones that more companies than realize it can access. You can also bolt on habit forming products. So for example, the rise of content marketing is all about bolting on the habit of consuming content as a habit around a product that is not necessarily itself habit forming. So a content consumption habit, a community habit is something that you can form around the product. So the result of that engagement is eventual monetization. And there's an article on my blog where I talk about exactly this, about what do you do with the product that is not used frequently enough, right? Or how do you build a product for a product how do you build a habit for a product that isn't used with sufficient frequency? It's on my blog as well. Happy to share that.
Well, super. I think that also answered a couple of questions from two other folks who are talking about, is creating low prices, discounts, the only way to create habit-forming products for some.
That's the worst way to create habits. Discounts.
Not a sustainable way at all.
Please listen. Discounts and coupons and gimmicks are the worst way to create habits. They create short-term engagements, but what you are doing is that you are looking for the worst kind of customer. You're looking for a customer that doesn't like to pay full price, right? So you're finding them, you're pulling them to you, and you're training the rest of your customer base to expect constant discounts. There's a brand, I don't think they're in every country, but there's a brand in the United States called Bed Bath & Beyond. And Bed Bath & Beyond got into this habit of mailing discounts to people. So that today, if you shop there without one of these coupons, they send them so frequently, you're an idiot, right? Like everybody knows you do not shop at Bed Bath & Beyond without a 20% discount.
Yeah.
And so they train their customers to expect constant discounts. And that's what they do. They wait to buy until they have a coupon. So price is one type of incentive. It's actually the worst kind. Of the 3 types of variable rewards, tribe, hunt, and self, a discount, a coupon, is rewards of the hunt, right? It's about some kind of material possession. But let me tell you, rewards of the tribe and rewards of the self are much more long lasting, and they cost you nothing. So explore those as well.
Well, awesome. I think that summarizes it. We have several of them, but in the interest of time, actually, there's one particularly interesting one, which as a quote from you said, "In being indistractable is a new skill set." So, I think, that's a motivation enough for folks here to actually go and look at your next book, the new book, Indistractable, and see how you explain that. So thank you so much, Nir. Appreciate your time. But before you just go away, request all the folks to give your feedback on the poll that shows up, and also would like to give the virtual token of appreciation from all of us, Nir. This is you'll see that quickly in your email, but scan the QR code when you get it, and you will be on our Hall of Fame on the Institute's website. Truly appreciate you taking the time out and giving us these insights. Thank you so much.
Wonderful, my pleasure. I'm taking a picture of it right now.
Yes, please. And you are on the Hall of Fame of the Institute's website. Appreciate it.
Wonderful. Thank you. It was a pleasure, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.